This week, we're taking a look at group processes. Group processes deals with how small groups coordinate and interact, or how decisions are made by individuals in smaller group settings. In this video, we're going to look at status characteristics theory. Status characteristics theory applies to task groups. Task groups are quite common in society. Anytime a group gets together to solve a problem or to do a job, we have a task group. Examples of task groups include juries, working teams or departments within corporations, and group projects in university classes. Task groups are fairly easy to identify. Generally, if a group is a task group, then it's possible for someone outside the group to evaluate the success or failure of the group's project. Think about a jury involved in a criminal trial. A jury needs to deliberate on the guilt or innocence of the accused. And it's possible for someone who is not a part of the jury to determine whether or not the jury succeeded at their task, whether or not they reached a verdict or they became a hung jury. And so juries are considered task groups. There's other kinds of groups that are not task groups. Think about, for example, a bunch of people getting together to hang out. Right? The point of a group like that is to socialize. And you really can't tell if the group succeeded or failed at socializing unless you're a member of the group. So a jury is a task group. What's interesting about task groups is that the influence of individuals within the group is rarely uniform. There are always some members who have more control over the group's decision-making process than others, even in cases where there's no official leader of the group. Think about the implications of that fact for a jury. If 3 out of the 12 jurors have more influence than the other 9, then their opinions on the case are ultimately going to have more weight on the jury's collective decision about the guilt or innocence of the defendant. So task groups matter. Juries are an important example of task groups, but they're not the only example. In fact, task groups are incredibly common throughout society. Over the course of your life, you're going to be in countless task groups. And the outcomes of the decisions that are made by these groups can have a big impact on your life. If you get a job in the corporate world, you'll likely find yourself working in a team of other employees. If you only have a small amount of influence on the group's decision-making process, you might not get much credit for the group's work. Or you might be seen in the corporation as more of a follower and less of a leader, and that can impact promotion decisions. So how influence is distributed in this kind of group is actually a really important question. And to get an answer to that question, let's look at status characteristics theory. Status characteristics theory applies to task groups. The theory explains how the power and prestige order of these groups develop. The power and prestige order of a group describes how much influence and control each group member has over the group's interaction. Those that are higher in a group's power and prestige order will have greater influence over the group's interaction when compared to those that are lower in the group's order. And this influence is manifested in task-oriented behaviors. Task-oriented behaviors are behaviors produced by a group member that are related to the group's task and are directed towards others in the group or towards the group as a whole. There are a lot of behaviors that a group member can produce. But here are a few important ones. Group members can provide suggestions about the group's task, criticize the suggestions of others in the group, praise or agree with the suggestions of others. They can interrupt others, and they can attempt to convince people to change their mind. Members of a group that are high in the group's power and prestige order are more likely to provide suggestions about the group's task. They're more likely to criticize the suggestions of others. They're more likely to have their own suggestions praised or agreed with by other members, and they're more likely to interrupt other members. Cumulatively, these behavioral patterns advantage members that are high in the group's power and prestige order. So if you're high in a group's order, you can exert more influence over the group's interaction. On average, the decisions that task groups make will be more like the initial opinions of those people that are higher in the group's power and prestige order, and less like the initial opinions of those that are lower in the group's order. I want to illustrate the concept of power and prestige orders and the best way I can think to do that is to look at an actual discussion that's happening in a group. So I'm about to show you a clip that comes from a documentary about Hillary Clinton. In this clip, she and her advisors are trying to develop a strategy for how to discuss the results of the 2016 Democratic Iowa caucus. There are a lot of task-oriented behaviors happening in this interaction, but I'm going to point out a few as the video plays.
So we got to think what we're going to do. We got to think about how we're going to play it, what we're going to say, when we're going to do whatever it is we're going to do.
When we started telling people in background,
What?
we started telling people in background that he got the turnout that he wanted, and we're still winning.
Yeah, well,
So,
but we have to decide if we're going to go out and say that, even though everything's not in.
yeah.
And, you know, what the consequences of that are if we go out, we say it, and then, you know, we end up behind.
Right.
I just don't want him to get out.
Yeah.
And claim the revolution is working, people felt the burn, we're on the way, we're gonna win this, you know, that's what, if I were he, that's what I
He's
think
gonna
he
say
should
that.
do.
This is gonna be like a half a point either way, so it's just not enough
gonna
out
change
there.
fundamentally.
Can't
So-
change, so.
Okay, let's figure it out.
I think we can say, oh, this is
Yeah.
great for the party.
I mean,
great,
you know,
yeah.
the turnout.
If we
Okay,
go out
thanks,
there and
Tom.
start talking about, well, it's good for the party, that is not a winner's, I mean, that is not like.
So I'm just gonna interrupt for 1 second because it's gotten.
Closer.
She's
It goes
basically
either way.
her like what's top of mind, what has her pacing up and down the hall
She
is
doesn't want him going.
she doesn't want him out first. Now they said he was gonna call, which obviously I don't know. We're holding the
Right.
phone. I mean, they said he was gonna call. That hasn't happened. She's just gonna freak out.
This thing is so close. I think we just, if he's.
We believe he's
speaking,
gonna,
right?
we believe he's gonna go out before 11 p.m. and say he declare victory whether he wins or not.
Right.
Right, he's just done so well that he's
So
gonna
she
declare
should go
victory.
speak right now.
She should go.
We should go right
Let's
now.
go.
All right,
I don't
let's
think
go.
it's divided
So, if we could follow this group carefully and code each task-oriented behavior, what we would find is that the distribution of these behaviors is not uniform, that some people have more influence than others. How does that happen? Well, one important feature of power and prestige orders that we haven't talked about yet is that they are consensual. Suppose we have a group with an established power and prestige order. In it, we have some members who are high in the order. In other words, they're suggesting a lot of ideas, they're often critical of the ideas of others, and they interrupt people more frequently. We also have members that are low in the order. In other words, they suggest fewer ideas. They're more likely to agree with the ideas of others, and they get interrupted more often. If you were to go to each individual in the group and privately ask them to rank the other group members in terms of how useful they were to the group, what you would find is that the rankings would be very similar, regardless of the person's position in the order. That is, those who are at the top of the power and prestige order will be thought by most people in the group to be more capable than those lower in the order. What this means is that there's a relationship between beliefs about ability and a person's ranking in this group order. Status characteristics theory assumes that there's a causal relationship between beliefs about abilities and a person's position in the power and prestige order. The theory addresses this relationship by using the concept of a performance expectation. Performance expectations are anticipations of the likely performance of group members at the group's task. They represent an inference that's made by an individual about how well they think someone else is going to do at the task, or how useful they think another person is going to be to the group. Performance expectations are relative comparisons. They're made between the person and other people. That means that each group member anticipates their relative level of contribution compared to every other member of the group. How much am I going to contribute to the group compared to someone else in the group? Performance expectations are actually what cause the production of task-oriented behaviors in group members. And this should make sense. If you're in a task group and you want the group to be successful, then you want people who you believe are going to be more useful to the group to contribute more. If those people interrupt you, then you're more likely to tolerate it. Why? Because you believe they likely have useful things to say. And if they criticize an idea that you have, you're more likely to accept their criticism because you think they know more about the issue than you do. And if they suggest an idea to you, you're more likely to agree with them, again, because you think they know more than you do. On the other hand, if you believe that your contributions are going to be more useful than another member's, then the situation is reversed. You will likely suggest ideas more than that person, and that's because the group believes that your ideas are probably more useful. You're more likely to interrupt them too, and that's because everyone believes that what you have to say is more productive. And you're more likely to disagree with them, again, because there is a belief that you know more about the issue. Since each member of the group forms performance expectations for all other members of the group, a stable power and prestige order will emerge from the task-oriented behaviors of group members. I have been talking about performance expectations as if group members were explicitly aware of them. In reality, performance expectations are rarely an explicit part of an individual's thinking. Performance expectations usually operate outside the explicit awareness of an individual, influencing their behavior in non-conscious ways. So, performance expectations are anticipations about how well everyone in the group is going to perform at the task, and those anticipations regulate the task-oriented behaviors that make up a power and prestige order. But what causes performance expectations? Well, there's two core mechanisms that cause performance expectations: behavior and status characteristics. As you might have guessed, status characteristics theory is concerned with the effect of status on performance expectations and ultimately on the power and prestige order of a group. In popular conversations, status is often meant to mean things like prestige or esteem, but the definition of a status characteristic given by the theory is a bit more precise. Actually, status characteristics theory distinguishes between two kinds of status characteristics: specific and diffuse characteristics. A diffuse characteristic is a status characteristic that has multiple states, each of which are differentially evaluated. That means that generally society considers possessing one state better than possessing another. These states are connected to beliefs about specific task abilities, and they're connected to beliefs about general task abilities. So as an example, occupation is a diffuse status characteristic. Why? Because it has multiple states. You can be a sanitation worker, a retail sales clerk, a neurosurgeon, a Supreme Court justice, so on. Each of these is a different state of occupation. And those states are differentially evaluated by our society. Generally speaking, society considers it better to possess some states of occupation over other states. For example, in our society, it's better in most ways to be a Supreme Court justice compared to a sanitation worker. I mean, which would you rather be? Finally, and crucially, those states are related to beliefs about specific and general task abilities. Compared to the sanitation worker, a Supreme Court justice will be thought to be better at tasks that require an understanding of the law. That much seems obvious, but they're also going to be thought to be better at most tasks. In other words, they have a higher generalized task ability than a sanitation worker. Specific status characteristics work in the exact same way. The only difference is that they have no related beliefs about generalized task abilities. So specific status characteristics have multiple states, each of which are differentially evaluated, and whose states are connected to beliefs about specific task abilities, but they do not have beliefs about general task abilities. As an example, scores on a standardized math exam are a specific status characteristic. There are multiple states. You can score high or low, you can get a 50 or a 100. Society considers higher scores better than lower ones, so those states are differentially evaluated. And those states are related to specific task abilities. In this case, scores on a math exam are related to tasks that are thought to require mathematical ability. But specific status characteristics lack beliefs about general task abilities. So if you score well on a math exam, that does not mean that people will believe that you're likely to be good at sports or that you're likely to be good at foreign languages. Status characteristics theory argues that differences in states of a status characteristic influence how performance expectations are formed. This process is known as status generalization. In other words, when people become aware of the status differences between themselves and others in their group, then they will infer different levels of ability on the basis of those differences. People with higher states of an active status characteristic will be thought by the group to be more capable than those with lower states. So, the core process of the theory is as follows. Differences in status generalize to produce performance expectations. Those performance expectations influence the formation of the group's power and prestige order, and ultimately produce groups in which some people have more control and influence than others. So this theory is ultimately explaining how broad beliefs about socially defined status manifest inside small groups, regulating the interaction of those groups and distributing influence and power. Notice that the theory does not require an actual difference in abilities across status. All that is required for status to have an effect is that there is a belief that differences in abilities exist across states of a status. The fact that people infer ability when there's no actual evidence for ability can have a fairly pernicious effect in task group interactions. For example, in our society, race functions as a diffuse status characteristic. There is a lot of evidence that shows people infer ability on the basis of race, even in situations when there's clearly no actual difference in ability across two racially differentiated people. This has an effect in task groups, in groups like juries, or in groups like teams within corporations. It means that minority members are more likely to be low in power and prestige orders, and consequently, they get fewer opportunities to contribute. That ultimately means that on average, they're likely to reap fewer of the rewards for their participation in those groups. So, status characteristics theory shows us how beliefs that have spread across an entire society can persist and negatively impact people, even in the absence of explicit or openly held racism. The effects of race as a status characteristic operate in small groups, and the individuals within those groups, without any explicit awareness that they're being influenced by beliefs on race, act on those beliefs. Okay, so that's a pretty negative note to end the video on. So instead, I'm going to look at the assumptions of the theory. Status characteristics theory has 5 core assumptions. We've already talked about some of them, but the theory, along with the assigned readings for this week, explicitly spells them out. So I want to review them here. The salience assumption states that all differentiating status information, along with any status directly linked to the task, will be salient. A minute ago, I talked about the idea of status information that is active in a situation. The salience assumption explains what status information will be active. According to this assumption, if group members are differentiated on one status characteristic, say for example, one group member is a high school graduate and another is a college graduate, then the status characteristic will be active in the situation, and that characteristic will affect the formation of performance expectations. This assumption also holds that any status that is culturally understood to be linked to the task will also be active. And that means that someone can have a status characteristic that no one else in the group has. And if people believe that that characteristic is relevant to the group, then it becomes active. Any status characteristic that is active in the situation will be treated by group members as relevant to the task and will influence the formation of performance expectations unless the group believes for certain that the status characteristic is not relevant to the task. What this means is that unless group members explicitly believe that a status has no relationship to a task, then they are going to treat it as if it does have an effect. In other words, the burden of proof is to show that status has no effect, rather than to show that it does have an effect. If group members leave the group, or if a new group member enters the group, or if the group moves on to a new task, then the performance expectations transfer to the new group or task. What this means is that if one or two members leave the group, that does not cause the power and prestige order of the group to be totally reworked. Instead of causing a new power and prestige order to be built from the ground up, members entering into the group are integrated into the group's existing order, and their integration is based off the relative states of the status characteristics that they occupy. Also, the power and prestige order of a group will transfer to new tasks. So if the group transitions from one task to another task, then they take their existing order with them. Although research has shown that switching tasks does weaken the order a little bit. All salient status information will be involved in the process of status generalization. So if a status characteristic is active in the situation, then it's going to have an effect on the formation of performance expectation. This assumption is actually very technical. I've greatly abbreviated it here. The theory gives us a very precise method for combining all of the different status information to calculate performance expectations, but we don't need to get into that. I just want you to know that if a status characteristic is salient, then it contributes to status generalization. That means that you can have people who are differentiated on a number of characteristics. For example, you can have education as a status, but also race as a status, and gender, and occupation. The theory claims that all of these things are going to have a combined effect. Once status information has been aggregated, the position of every group member in the power and prestige order is a direct function of their performance expectation. So this assumption just states that performance expectations cause the formation of a power and prestige order, what we've been talking about this whole time. So that's status characteristics theory in a nutshell. This theory explains how task groups become organized and how the influence of group members is distributed across the group. I know that might not seem like much, but like I said, there are a lot of task groups in society. When we think about groups like juries, we tend to think of them as a sort of level playing field, where everyone in the group gets their say. But status characteristics theory shows us this is not really the case. That there are going to be certain people in those juries that have more influence than others, and their influence is ultimately caused by the status differences of the members that compose those groups. Think about that. Okay, I'll see you in the next video.